Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Dami Adewale.
And I'm Lucinda, Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be asking how the voluntary sector can ensure it has the right leaders to operate to its full potential, and thinking specifically about how a new, younger generation of leaders can be better supported. But first, we're joined by our senior news reporter, Emily Hall, who reported last week on a Charity Commission inquiry into the transgender youth charity Mermaids. So, Emily, for someone with no knowledge of this inquiry, which has been rumbling on for a good couple of years now, can you please take us back to the beginning? What is going on?
So the Charity Commission began investigating Mermaids in 2022 after members of the public and the media raised multiple concerns about its services and management. This included fears around its chest-binding services and alleged ties between the charity's former chief executive, Susie Green, and the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, which provided gender identity care for children and young people. The inquiry has been very high profile due to the continued discourse around trans rights and gender affirmative care that we've seen across the UK. The inquiry report, which was released last week, has found no evidence of those ties between the charity and Tavistock, and it also found no evidence of safeguarding issues or misconduct relating to medical advice, which, if the charity had been giving medical advice, that would have gone against its charitable purpose. But it did find wider governance failures, including that the charity's governance and culture had failed to keep pace with its growing size and the amount of attention that the charity has been getting. And it also found failure to carry out sufficient due diligence in trustee recruitment.
I do find this particular case really interesting because really it should just be a charity governance issue, but because of the cause area that Mermaids is involved in and the whole wider public debate around trans people's rights, it has become such a bigger, more mainstream story. But there was something particularly interesting about the regulator's report, right, in terms of the CAS review.
Yes, and you're right, it has become very polarising, this entire discussion. The regulator has done something really unusual here. So it has ordered that the charity must abide by the CAS review in relation to its information that it provides on puberty blockers, and also if it chooses to resume its gender binding services, which it stopped in 2022 following the public concerns. Firstly, to understand this, we need to know a little bit about the CAS review. So the CAS review itself was an independent review of children and young people's gender identity services, which was carried out by Dr. Hilary Cass. The review was fairly controversial, particularly in the charity space. So charities such as Mermaids, including Mermaids, met the review with complaints about a lack of clarity and concerns that it was enabling willful misinformation. And the review itself even led to a temporary ban on puberty blockers in the UK for under 18-year-olds, which caused even further concerns from charities working in this space. The CAS review itself is not legislation or guidance. So that makes this decision from the regulator very unusual and very interesting. And what's more, the regulator has also said that all charities working in this space will need to reflect the CAS review, not just Mermaids. So this is despite many charities having outwardly spoken against this review. It seems that the Commission is kind of stepping into that cause area in a way that we haven't really seen it do, at least in recent years.
Emily, we've heard about the issues raised by LGBTQ charities on this topic, but looking more broadly, why is this concerning for the sector as a whole?
The regulator deciding to enforce this for charities who are working in the transgender support space, this raises real questions about the role of the Commission and what regulation it can provide and how far that regulation can step into cause areas. We kind of don't know what is going to happen with this. We don't know how far the regulator is going to enforce this. We don't know what they're going to do to enforce this. And I think that's something that we need to keep an eye on.
Moving on to this week's main discussion, we're here to ask how the sector can develop the right leaders to make sure voluntary organisations are operating to their full potential. Leadership development is often considered something of a luxury, or at least low priority expenditure in charities with limited HR budgets, and particularly small ones where the chief executive might also be the finance officer, maybe the head of procurement, and even possibly the office cleaner. But effective management is critically important for voluntary organisations to make the most of the resources they have available and deliver the services and functions they exist to perform. And as we're going to explore today, the types of people in leadership positions are critical for the sector to overcome historical power imbalances and ensure it remains fit for purpose in today's society.
We're joined by two guests in the studio for this discussion. First up is Nadia Alomar, Chief Executive of Clore Social Leadership, a charity that works to develop leaders with a social purpose. Hi, Nadia.
Hi there. And also with us is Beki Osborne, Chief Executive of Sexual Assault and Abuse Support Service, Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. And Beki has formed a community of charity chief executives who are in their mid-30s or younger. Hi, Beki.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So, Nadia, you work for an organisation that operates to develop leadership in the social sector. How have you seen leadership change for better or worse in recent years?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I just wanted to start by saying there's an incredible amount of wonderful charities doing amazing work in the charity sector whom we'll probably never, ever get to hear about. There's probably the 80%. But we talk most about the top 2% who have got really good resources. We know and love them. I'm going to try and keep this really balanced because, want to make it as accessible as possible. We can't have this conversation without mentioning the decreased resources. That is obviously, it's no kind of breaking news, that obviously has an incredible impact on leaders. It's forced leaders to have a razor sharp focus on keeping the lights on and kind of concentrate on operational efficiency, form strategic partnerships just to sustain services. So that has been one impact that we have definitely seen. There's a kind of an increase of skills needed for that purpose. But there's so many others, and we can obviously dedicate the whole podcast to this, but just to mention wellbeing is also a huge one, a shift on the focus of wellbeing. I think also, I'm going to mention lockdown. I'm really sorry, but that has, obviously it was huge what happened to us. And I think that impact kind of continues to blur the lines with regards wellbeing, both in terms of how leaders support their teams, but also themselves. I think those blurred lines can be quite confusing and not always so helpful. But the good side of it is people are concentrating on wellbeing and seeing that as an integral part of leading successful outcomes for the issues that they're dealing with. The second bit I would mention with regards leadership and change is definitely innovation. Mm-hmm. Leaders needing to innovate. These are the ones who are doing really well at the moment. It's really difficult to do this because it is difficult not to be impacted negatively and severely by some of the systemic issues that we're working within, but the ones who are able to kind of not look over that, but certainly navigate that and see the opportunities out there are the ones who are doing really well, it seems. A huge focus on inclusivity, that's the next one. A wonderful change to that. Obviously, where it is most ideal and works best is when it's authentic and genuine. And I'm sure talking about leadership, we'll be discussing more of that as well. But also the focus on leadership development, whereas a few years ago, it was most definitely seen as, well, really not seen as something that many charity leaders would do. But how can it not be? It is absolutely integral to everything we do, how we behave, how we operate, how we communicate. So that's a really welcome shift that we are seeing. But also, again, maybe a little bit since the pandemic in recent times, because people have seen the impact of good and bad leadership on teams, organisations, countries, the world. So that shift has been very welcome.
And I just wanted to have a chat with you, Beki, about this. What challenges have you encountered as a chief executive in your early 30s then?
Yeah, sure. So, there are many, and a lot of the challenges that I've personally experienced wouldn't necessarily be just because of my age, but certainly when I took on the role as a CEO, I was offered the role when I was 30. And one of the kind of first questions that I was kind of confronted with when I was meeting my new team was, how old was I? How did I have the experience to essentially effectively lead the organisation and them as a team? And so there's a lot of pressure on you to not only deal with what you normally have to deal with as a small charity CEO, but you have to do that extra work to make sure that you're pushing things forward. And I'm really, really lucky that I've got an incredibly supportive board of trustees, but speaking with many other young CEOs as part of the work that we've been doing with the Young CEO Forum, that's not necessarily the case. And I think a lot of the challenge has to be around just how the third sector is currently governed and structured. So the average age of a trustee at the moment is 55 plus, and that rises if you're a small charity, so it's 65 plus. And so if you're thinking about a young CEO in their 30s, and certainly what Nadia talked about diversity, increased diversity, that's something we've seen in the Young CEO Forum, innovation, so lots of people wanting to innovate, but ultimately the power always sits with the board of trustees, and that their frame of reference will be very different and their life experiences will be very different to the young CEOs that they're managing. And that can be quite a challenge, and it can be quite demoralizing for the young CEO who actually wants to move forward, progress, change and innovate, but often comes up against internal barriers to be able to do that.
And you wrote a LinkedIn post earlier this year about ageism facing young chief executives, and you issued a call to action for others experiencing the same. Could you tell us what happened next?
Yeah, definitely. So I went along to the Akivo conference. I'm a member of Akivo, our organisation is, and I met my colleague Daisy there, and we kind of felt that we were probably the only 2 or 3 people under 50 in that space. And so we naturally connected, and we thought that it'd be nice to kind of chat with other younger CEOs to talk about the ageism and kind of the challenges that were specific to our age group as a leader in the third sector. And we put it out on LinkedIn thinking we'd get maybe 4 or 5 of us together for a coffee, and we were contacted by over 150 young leaders across the UK.
Wow.
Yeah. So we were really overwhelmed, and what we have been really shocked at is the lack of data about the leaders that we have currently in the third sector. There's probably, like you said, Nadia, there are a lot of young leaders doing amazing things out there, but we just don't know who they are or kind of what they're doing. And so that makes it really challenging to think about what the issues are, because we don't understand what the data is to begin with.
And Nadia, have you seen the sort of emergence of a younger generation of leaders in the sector, perhaps people who are joining some of the programs that you put on at Clore Social Leadership?
Yeah, definitely. And really welcome that as well. They're doing so well in challenging the status quo. And that can be seen as disruptive, can be positive, negative. I take that as a real positive, because I would really like to see a shift where people are questioning things, where they're not okay with how things are being done, because we've done that for far too long. So let's be vocal about it. Let's be effective about how to make change. And we are seeing people coming up through our programs who are younger and younger, concentrating on developing themselves so they can lead their organizations more effectively.
And in terms of the development needs for somebody in their late 20s, early 30s versus somebody who's perhaps been in the voluntary sector for a couple of decades or perhaps come from somewhere else, is there a difference in terms of what support they need to be delivering on the best of their potential?
I think some capabilities and skills are dialed up a little bit with the generation coming up. So it could be the confidence and communication, and also managing up. So dealing with more traditional views, dealing with boards, as Beki said, who are predominantly older and wanting to make change within that structure. So definitely, yes, managing up, increase communication, also increase confidence, because often they're very isolated, feeling very lonely doing this role. Thankfully, we've got people like Beki who reach out and actually are proactive about trying to get these wonderful leaders together. But those, I would say those are probably the main points.
So Beki, with what you've experienced so far, could you just tell me, how can the sector's younger, more junior workforce be developed to become the next generation of leaders?
So I think, and it's interesting that you mentioned confidence, Nadia, because that's something that we are often told as younger leaders that we need help developing in, but that's not been my experience, and it's certainly not one of the key issues that I've heard from younger CEOs. When I was offered the CEO role, I got offered nearly over 10 courses about my imposter syndrome. So there was just an assumption that I felt invalidated in my experiences, that I felt unconfident, and that wasn't the case at all. For me, what I'd like to see in terms of leadership programs and kind of support for younger leaders is giving us the tools and the vocabulary to look at some of the structural issues. We can't mindfulness our way through a funding crisis. It might be helpful to do a power post before you go into a tricky board meeting or partnership meeting, but I'd like to start thinking about, why are those meetings and those spaces being set up to make us feel unwelcome or unworthy? And rather than individualizing the problem to say, well, it's your problem that you're younger and you're not confident, you're not experienced enough, it's looking at the experiences that you do bring, it's looking at the new perspectives that you bring. And I think that's something definitely with the younger CEO group that we've been working with, is that we're a lot more diverse, not just in terms of age, but in terms of gender, race, sexuality, disability. So we're bringing lots of different perspectives in, and it's actually thinking about how we can support those and kind of give a bit of a rocket to some of these skills to help innovate, rather than trying to teach us tricks that might have worked 20, 30 years ago, but aren't necessarily going to be helpful right now.
That's a really interesting observation on the diversity of that group. I mean, you said about 150 people responded to your LinkedIn post, but do you have any idea of the extent of this sort of diversity? I guess there's this whole lack of information, lack of data is a problem.
Yeah, definitely. So we don't hold a data set, and there isn't one available. It's more of a anecdotal when we've been getting together and having our kind of group meetings and having people reach out, that they do tend to be a more diverse group than other CEO forums or conferences that I've certainly been to. And I think that's reflective in over 90% of boards in the UK are white. So that's going to cause other issues for the younger CEO as well, when they're working with people that just don't have the same frame of reference as they do.
And so Nadia, we spoke to Yusuf Chifchi, Head of Refugee Involvement at the Refugee Council, on this podcast in the summer. He spoke about the struggles of getting managerial experience as a person with lived experience. He also talked about the value of leadership development training he received from Clore Social Leadership. So how can people from historically underrepresented groups be supported in their leadership journey, do you think?
Yeah, thank you for that. And we love Yusuf at Clore Social. We've asked him back to speak to our cohorts as well. So he's a very valued member of our community. How can they be supported, people with lived experience? I think this really comes from, it comes from current people in the sector making a huge change, doing things differently, being curious. What we've talked about sometimes within our team and within our programs is to think about how you would welcome someone into your home.
Yeah.
So let's just use that as an analogy. If you're inviting someone totally new, maybe someone outside of your friendship group from a place you're not familiar with, you may meet them outside your door, you may meet them at the door, you would make an effort to communicate in a way that's effective for them, that way where you can both be aligned. You would introduce them to others in your home, highlight where they have things in common, you'd show them around your house, ask about their preferences, so on and so forth. I really hope that you wouldn't get them to figure out how to enter the home, put them in a corner, let them get on with it, put dinner on the table, not ask them if that's okay with them, and make them find their way to the dining table and just be forced to eat what everyone else is eating. I mean, it sounds really silly, but that is sometimes what we do in organisations. Now, sometimes we're stretched, sometimes there's a lack of awareness there, sometimes even worse. There's a curiosity that we need to bring to our organisations as well and to our work lives with the same people who would probably act very differently outside of work than we're acting inside work. So creating that welcoming space for people is absolutely vital. What we wouldn't do is do that latter scenario and then they leave and we wonder why they've left. I mean, it's kind of obvious. So it's that obviously, work dynamics are very different. They're also there to do a job. We also need to make an effort and meet them halfway. So just be a little bit curious, just ask people, don't jump to conclusions. Create that culture, role model that culture where everyone feels welcomed and is able to do their job and do things differently to get a different result.
Beki, you've been nodding along there. Does any of what Nadia's just said ring true with the discussions that you've been having in the Young CEO group?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think younger CEOs, again, it's anecdotal, but a lot of us have lived experience of the issues that we're working on, and there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm for making things better for the future. And I think it's about everyone kind of accepting us for the whole person, especially what Nadia was saying earlier about well-being and kind of that resilience building that we've been doing, and more discussions around mental health. It's about just accepting people for who they are and trying to find their superpowers and how we can support them, rather than trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah. And as you said earlier, it's the whole governance around what job that person is doing and how they're performing it that is so critical in making sure that the peg and the hole are aligned and compatible. Nadia, we are in a difficult time in the voluntary sector. As you said at the beginning, resource is a massive issue for so many charities, and especially smaller ones. How, in your opinion, can charities support leadership growth within their organisations at a time when they might not have the ideal amount of budget to do so?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because you don't always need a huge budget to do this. I mean, it's like anything. If you're able to put resource and investment into it, then wonderful. You will know that within your own context. If you're not able to do that, I would say the first thing to identify, well, first of all, it's not a luxury, is what I would carry on saying. Leadership development, training, skills and development is not a luxury. If we said that in almost any other sector, well, it wouldn't go down well. People invest in training, they invest in their people. So the first thing I would say is do a bit of reflection, do a bit of asking. What are the leadership needs? What are people's strengths and areas of development? Where do you need the organisation to go? How does that align? And also involve your team members. It's their development, and the more involved they are, the more engaged they'll be, the more they'll get out of it. Also on that note, many organisations do already do some things, whether it's profiling, tools that can be low cost or free. They already are doing some things in their organisation, but what often doesn't happen is the follow through. So they'll do that, but we'll still continue to do roles that aren't necessarily suited to our strengths. So it's, again, a little bit of what Beki was saying about the round peg in a square hole, or the other way around. It doesn't matter. But definitely just being intentional with following through with that. And there are so many free or low-cost resources and courses out there. You can share this among staff, get them to share with each other, start a learning hub, and change just won't happen overnight. But steps can be taken, especially if you're intentional about it. Steps can be taken to change for the best for your people and for your organisational outcomes. But there's also bringing it up with the board. And that's incredibly important. It's business imperative to have skilled and healthy staff and volunteers. And your board should understand and appreciate that you're thinking about this. Now, they may have contacts, ideas, their own networks they can ask about how this can be done. There could be, for example, if you're a leader who doesn't have the headspace, or you don't feel the background or whatever, to come up with a leadership development plan or training plan for your staff, you could put something out there on LinkedIn or any other kind of network to ask if someone can volunteer 2-3 hours of their time to just help think that through with you. There's a whole world out there that is potentially there to help you. And it's really, when you're struggling for survival within the organisation, it's often difficult to remember that. But please do know that people do want to help. And what's the worst that can happen if you ask and if they say no for whatever reason, you move on. Then there are loads of other things. There's peer learning circles you can do internally, job shadowing, job swaps, support staff to lead projects and guide them through that with regular check-ins. Mentoring can be free or low cost, so on and so forth. So there are lots of different ideas.
Thank you. And Beki, in your own professional development journey, are there any of these things mentioned by Nadia that you found to be particularly useful or less useful?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I would agree with what Nadia said around kind of it is a risk and it needs to be taken seriously if charities don't invest in professional development, not just for their leaders, but for their whole staff and even their board of trustees. It's something you said at the beginning, Lucinda. I'm a small charity CEO, so that means that I'm not just the CEO, I'm the CFO, I'm the CTO, I'm pretty much everything. We don't have any internal HR, all of those things, and you can't be an expert in absolutely everything. So it's about having that facility to be able to get that expertise or develop it yourself if you need to. But something that I'm really passionate about is mentoring, which is something that Nadia said. And I actually deliver and design feminist mentoring programs myself, because what I saw an absence of in the sector was mentoring which went beyond the kind of traditional mentoring models that we see, which is typically an older person sharing their knowledge or expertise with a younger person. And sometimes that can be useful, but what that doesn't think about is the structural inequalities and the power imbalances that exist in our society and in the third sector. So, for example, I've had advice from older male CEOs, which is well-intentioned, but just wouldn't work for me as a younger woman in the sector. Equally, there are privileges that I have that, Black and minoritized younger leaders don't have. When we think about mentoring, we've got to think about the structures and the barriers that the mentees are experiencing, and not just expect that something that worked 20 or so years ago is necessarily going to work for that younger person.
Could you give an example of a piece of advice that you've been given that you thought this really isn't helpful?
Yeah, and I think the advice was definitely helpful, but as a feminist, I didn't feel totally comfortable with it. And it was something that I was trying to build a better relationship with a statutory partner, as a lot of small charities have to deal with. And I was told to smile more.
Oh.
And I think the idea was to become their ally rather than become that annoying voice that turns up to partnership meetings and goes, this isn't acceptable every time. Because they said what you don't want to do is every time your name's mentioned or you walk into a room, eyes begin to roll. And again, I think the advice was well intentioned because we want to try and tackle that. But for me, it's a bit like what I was saying earlier, is that the problem isn't me and not my ability to smile. The problem is actually the space that we're in and the structures that we exist in. And that's why I think feminist mentoring is a much more advanced version than the traditional mentoring models.
So, Beki, I just wanted to continue with that topic there. Obviously, you brought up the feminist mentoring, but how else could younger chief executives be supported? And why might that mentoring from older chief executives not be that desirable?
Well, I think it could be desirable, but what I think I'm saying is that that's not necessarily the answer for everyone. I think we need to be doing more work around what the structures look like and actually giving younger leaders the tools to start working through them, or ideally dismantling them and building something new. Because something I'm really, really concerned about is the mass exodus of younger talent and leaders from our sector. Because certainly, if you were to take on a CEO role in your kind of 40s or 50s, you're looking at a much smaller time frame before retirement to someone who's taking on a CEO role in their 20s or 30s. And so you're just having to think about, can I sustain this level of stress and pressure? And can I continually go up against these barriers for the next 30 or 40 or however long we have to work until we can retire these days? So I think that the more that we find answers in the individual, the less likely we are to actually deal with the root causes of some of these issues. And if we can focus on, collectively working together on these structural power imbalances and inequalities that exist in the third sector, that will give younger leaders hope. And actually, we will be able to use younger leaders' kind of energy and enthusiasm and skills to imagine what that could look like for us.
I totally agree with what Beki's saying, but also this isn't the only time where we've had multiple generations in the workforce and where tensions have come up. We also cling on to a label sometimes as well. There is a lot of evidence to say that it's down to the preferences, skills, behaviours of individuals, and that diversity is made up of young and old, and it's the behaviours within that group that make up that inclusive, forward-thinking, helpful, effective leadership and change, which could involve quite a few older people who are that way inclined and who maybe were ahead of their time or just more open to change and wanting to see fresh new ideas, young generation coming up and thriving.
I think that's a really interesting note to end it on. So Nadia and Beki, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Nadia and Beki, and that's it for this week. We'll be back next week to hear two guests make the case for using the phone more to drum up new supporters and strengthen relationships with existing ones. As ever, if you would like to get in touch with us to suggest new topics or give us some feedback, you can email me. The address is in the show notes, and we also have our survey always open. For now, thank you for listening. Our producer is Nav Pal.